Japan was never on my radar. Being this young British guy who's never experienced any kind of tropical weather before, a gust of wind hit me. I'm kind of slide down the street a bit, hurt my foot. So I was like, yeah, stupid. It's a constant exercise in risk management, curiosity, a sense of adventure, a love of travel. How is the rain gonna kill me?
Welcome to Unpacking Japan. I'm Toby, and today we welcome James from Earth Uncut TV, where you chase storms all over Japan and the rest of Asia and the world. Thank you for coming.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I found your channel a few months ago and I was really fascinated by this very unique, I don't know how to call it, hobby that you have of looking into typhoons, how they grow, how they expand, and actually going on location to film what's happening. And we want to get into all of that. But first, I want to ask you, what brought you to Japan in the first place? Why are you here?
Well, it was quite a roundabout journey. So I was born in the UK. That's where I grew up. And I was really lucky as a young kid. My dad used to be a pilot. So from a very young age, I was able to do a lot of traveling to different parts of the world. As a family, we got really cheap plane tickets. So that meant I was quite young, probably I think 12 or 13 was my first trip to Asia. And I just got the travel bug. And then when I left school, I ended up spending about 8 months in Southeast Asia, backpacking in Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, places like that. And it just really got into my skin and into my soul. I just fell in love with Asia. And then by the time it was, I was heading to college, I was originally like a biochemistry major, but I wanted to be in Asia. So I had to kind of think about what I wanted to do or study, which would give me an excuse to come back here. So I actually ended up switching my major and studying Chinese. So that was 4 years of study in Edinburgh in the UK doing Chinese. And then as soon as I graduated, I was like, I'm done with the UK, I'm moving out to China. I ended up spending a couple of years there before moving down to Hong Kong. Spent 7 years there, met a lovely Japanese lady, which is a common theme of people who end up in Japan. We started a family in Hong Kong, and then in 2016, when the kids were still very young, we decided that, primarily for their sake, Japan was going to be a good place to bring up the family as they got bigger. So yeah, I think it's 6-7 years now.
It's
been
quite
living
the
here.
Journey, right? From biochemistry to living in China, but no particular prior interest into living in Japan specifically.
I hate to admit it, no. Japan was never on my radar. Well, I lie, actually it was when I had to choose my degree. The university I was enrolled in actually basically had two options. It was either Chinese or Japanese. And back in, the early 2000s, Japan always seemed like this, it's really expensive. I don't know much about it. China, it's a lot cheaper place to be a student. It just seemed more exciting and different to the UK. And back then China was like the up and coming place. Everyone was so excited about what was going on there, the growth opportunities, how it was going to be the new superpower of the world.
Like Japan in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, kind of. And as young people, we were like, I kind of like the idea of having a bit of a slice of that or having a go at that. So yeah, that's basically how I ended up in China. And spending 10 years, split between the mainland and Hong Kong. So
what was it like when you then decided to move to Japan and you arrived here after spending quite a bit of time in China, which is very different from what Japan is like? It's a completely new experience.
Yeah, Hong Kong was a very easy place to live. It's the official languages are Chinese and English, so that made just settling down and living there quite easy. So I kind of took it for granted. I thought it was going to be easy shifting from life in Hong Kong to Japan, just because I had, most of my adult life I've been living abroad. And actually, I was a bit complacent and was in for a little bit of a rude awakening when I arrived here, because there was a lot of different things that I wasn't expecting, which proved to be quite challenging, to be honest, in ways that, completely just came out of the blue. So it did take a while. It took a little bit longer than I was expecting to adjust to settling down here. But once overcome all those challenges, it's just been great. I love it.
Can you give some examples of some of those earlier surprises that you kind of had to adapt to?
Well, it was just like the banking system. Don't get anyone started who lives in Japan on the banks. It can be a little bit frustrating. Obviously, the bureaucracy with the 2 young kids, so getting them into like the school system or the hoikuen daycare system, that was a lot of work, which thankfully my wife was able to figure out. And then I was setting up my own small business as a sole proprietor, and then like tax return and all the boring, really, really boring stuff, like important day-to-day life, which I'd kind of managed to easily sort out by myself or had someone else help me beforehand. It was like, just felt like there was a never-ending list of bureaucracy, tasks, boring stuff to do.
Basically entering the system, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Setting yourself, becoming something in this system that works here only in Japan.
It's quite a big, complex system. Well, this was in 2016. I have to say the changes that have taken place in the last 6-7 years are amazing. The whole, so many different streamlined system. Whereas if you needed some document, you used to have to go to the ward office or whatever. Now you can just get it at 7-Eleven. So life is certainly a lot more convenient now. But yeah, no, it was frustrating. It wasn't the kind of smooth ride I was expecting it to be.
And now a few years later, you're quite settled, and somewhere along the way, you picked up this hobby of chasing typhoons. How did that start?
Yeah, this goes way back to my earliest kind of adult days in Asia. So I grew up in the UK. It's not famed for having very interesting weather, just kind of boring bad weather. But I was one of those kids who always used to love the documentaries on TV about earthquakes, volcanoes, and severe weather, mostly because we were never exposed to that in the UK. But it wasn't until 2005 where I was, as part of my studies in Chinese, I was in Taiwan on a scholarship in the summer of 2005 for a couple of months. And typhoons weren't even on my radar. It wasn't something I had even thought about. But it just so happened that the summer that I was there in Taipei, it was a really bad typhoon season for Taiwan. And the first one came through in July, and I remember hearing about it on the news and just being fascinated. I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think that these storms could be a thing that you could experience here. So I dove right into all the research. I was tracking the forecasts of the storm, and it was like, is it going to hit Taiwan? From days out when it was still way out in the Pacific. And each day went past, and the storm got stronger, and the track was heading right towards the island. I was like, oh wow, we're going to get hit by a serious typhoon here. And it crashed straight into Taiwan. It made landfall about 120 kilometers south. So that the worst of it was quite away from Taipei. But just being this young British guy who's never experienced any kind of tropical weather before, just even being on the periphery of it and just witnessing the power was like, wow. And it just lit this spark in me. I was just like, I need to see more of this. I need to investigate this weather more and experience it from like the core, where the worst of it takes place. And then, it all gets a bit weird and kind of unpredictable and random after that. But here I am, like 20 years later, with a bit of luck and a little bit of, a few smart decisions along the way, turn the whole thing into a business. And now I'm like an independent producer who is a storm chaser.
So for someone who's not familiar, I mean, the name is pretty self-explanatory, storm chaser, you run after storms. But can you maybe explain a little bit the framework? Like is there a specific meteorological study purpose behind what goes into chasing storms? As you said, you're an independent producer, so you don't just, there's a storm coming, I'm going to run into the middle. Like there's an approach to it, there's something you're looking for. What falls into this kind of a job?
Yeah, that's been a bit of an evolving story over the years. So primarily, when I first started doing this, it was all because of just pure curiosity, a sense of adventure, a love of travel. and just being in a part of the world where there are so many typhoons, tropical storms. So for those first few years when I was living in Taiwan, when I was still a student, it was all about just the discovery phase, just understanding what these storms are, what they're like to go through, driven purely by curiosity. The first typhoon I went into, I didn't even have a camera. And I was just went along and witnessed it all, and it's all just embedded in my head now. There's no pictures. But I think it was like the next year I got a very, very basic video camera. Hopped on a plane to Vietnam by myself and filmed a typhoon there. And this is very, very early in the days of YouTube. So 2006, I don't think it had been around very long there. So I just shot some pretty poor quality video of this storm hitting Vietnam. And it just seemed like the natural thing to do was just to get it out there, broadcast it. So I edited together a bit of a clunky video, put it on YouTube. And yeah, got quite a few views. And that was the only storm I filmed in 2006. I did the same again the next year. And then one day, this email arrived in my inbox from a producer in Germany. Actually, we're still Facebook friends to this day. And I owe him a lot because he was like, wow, we're making a documentary on typhoons. No one is kind of going after them or filming them. It's all just basically news crews who happen to be in the area. The footage you shot's really interesting. Can we license it off you? Here's our budget. And that was my first client. And that was kind of when I realized, there's a bit of a kind of a wider interest in what I'm doing here. My work, my pictures, my video actually appears to have some value to people out there in the world. And from that moment on, it took a few years, but the whole hobby slowly morphed into, a business opportunity.
That's really
the opportunity
cool.
to just become a freelancer who specializes in this. It did take a few years to get off the ground, but by 2012, it was, I was fully established, making a proper go of it as a full-time freelancer.
So the first question that comes to mind now, thinking about recording typhoons and doing that, is safety.
Yeah.
They can be devastating.
Yeah.
A lot of people get injured, people pass away, buildings get destroyed, cities get flattened. How do you manage? How do you approach this? Is there a quote unquote safe way to do your job, or is it something where you have to take kind of calculated risks? Yeah,
it's a risky endeavor. There are dangers. If it wasn't, everyone would do it. So that's how I've been able to do this for so long and just make a living being a producer who specializes in this, is because of the risks, the dangers, not only physically but just the wear and tear on the camera gear and the equipment. Just because there's very, very few people who do this, that means I've been able to kind of thrive doing it. But first and foremost, safety is the most important thing. I've been doing this for 20 years. I want to carry on doing this for 20 years. And it's really something which you learn as you go. You need to be in the storms. You need to experience them. You need to witness firsthand, the threats that they pose. You need to have a few close calls. You need to have things go wrong. And even to this day, it is still a giant learning curve. Even now you catch yourself getting complacent, you get sloppy, you make mistakes, you hurt yourself. You're like, that was stupid. A couple of years ago, I was just like, in Okinawa, where was I? Yeah, I was just like, the typhoon's not that bad. I'll just go out, wear my flip-flops, and walk around the street, knock off some shots. But, rule number one when you're filming a typhoon or a storm is you got to have proper footwear. So I broke that rule, of course. I was like, big gust of wind hit me. I'm kind of slide down the street a bit, hurt my foot. So I was like, yeah, stupid. But it's a constant exercise in risk management and just being very, very aware of your surroundings, what's going on, and trying to anticipate what could be in danger before it actually poses a threat to you. So there's no set formula. You just have to be very, self-aware and also aware of your surroundings and what's going on.
Is there like a sort of checklist that you have before you go into a typhoon and prepare to film your next documentary or something, that you're like, okay, I need to prepare this, I need to prepare this, I need to be aware of that information, this information? For example, I just watched your documentary for the 10 years of the Haiyan typhoon that hit the Philippines, also known as Yolanda, where at the beginning you're staying at a hotel and then you realize, okay, this building is not solid enough. We need to find a building that's built with different material, otherwise we'll be under the rubble.
Yeah.
Do you have this kind of checklist that you need to know before you go into a certain area to prepare as much as you can for any events?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with the typhoons, basically there are three things which are out to get you. So it's the rain, the wind, and then the sea. So whenever I'm on location or heading somewhere or, along a stretch of coast or area which is going to see a major typhoon impact, I'm always like, right, okay, how is the rain going to kill me? So I'm looking at, the flood risks. Am I going to be close to a mountain river or some big cliffs or areas which are prone to landslides or stretches of road where, they could get washed out or flooded? That's always something I'm looking out for. The wind, well, that's a pretty obvious one. That's the one which everyone kind of directly associates with typhoons. So that is, how am I going to keep safe from the wind? If it's a very, very strong typhoon, I'm going to need to have shelter, which is, a solid concrete building or a major, very large building of some sort. And then the ocean. Am I going to be traveling along roads at night which are right by the sea where the waves can come and inundate? Is there a big storm surge threat which is similar but different to a tsunami threat, but you're talking not just big waves but a big surge of water that moves inland?
So kind of like a flooding.
Yeah, but from the ocean, and it can be as destructive as a tsunami. So these are the kind of the three main things which are always, these are the things which are out to kill you, and you've always got to have in your mind about to keep yourself safe from those factors. So that's literally, as soon as I'm on location, as soon as I'm landing, I'm just processing everything, just saying, right, okay, is this location? What are the risks here? Okay, run from the water, hide from the wind is basically the saying we have. And if you're in a location where you can do that and tick those boxes, then by the time the storm comes, you're probably good to go.
We've been talking so far a lot about typhoons.
Yeah.
I know in the news we often also hear hurricanes.
Yes.
So I did the research once because I was curious, and as far as I understood, the difference is just typhoons are in Asia, hurricanes are like hitting, Florida and like the Caribbeans, and that's the only difference. But in terms of storms, they're pretty much the same. Yeah,
that's exactly it. It's basically just different name for kind of cultural reasons. So hurricane, I think, comes from the Spanish derivative of the word. I'm not going to even pretend to try and pronounce it in Spanish. Typhoons in Asia, cyclones, tropical cyclones in the southern hemisphere, all the same type of storm system. The only real difference is in the northern hemisphere, they spin anti-clockwise, and in the southern hemisphere, they spin clockwise. So,
interesting.
Yeah.
Within those cyclones, typhoons, do you have differences? We often hear categories from 1 to 5 or 6. What are those, and are there other differences between them?
Yeah, so a tropical cyclone is basically any type of hurricane, typhoon, regardless of the strength, from the weakest, which is usually a tropical storm, all the way up to a category 5 hurricane, or what we call out here informally a super typhoon. And there's a large amount, there's a big difference between the top of the scale and the beginning of the scale. They can all be very dangerous. So generally the weaker storms, their biggest threat that they pose is flooding rainfall. So in countries like, the Philippines or Taiwan or Central America, places like that, we've seen historically many times weak storms have hit those areas. But if there's a lot of mountains, they can dump massive amounts of rain and still kill thousands of people. But they just don't have much wind. But then you get up, to category 1, which is the weakest category of a hurricane, which you get when the winds hit 120 kilometers an hour, 75 miles an hour, 65 knots. So there's a different wind speed scales. So as soon as you hit basically 120 kilometers an hour, you've got a typhoon or a hurricane. And then that goes all the way up to, 250, 300 kilometer an hour sustained winds like in the upper echelon of
the highest
the
ever
category
recorded.
5s. Yeah. Wind gusts in excess of 200. Sorry, I'm getting all these.
A lot of numbers.
I'm getting all these, but the different scales. I'm getting confused. Regular non-weather folks get confused. Yeah, so 300 kilometer an hour plus winds possible. And that's where you're really keeping your head down and praying.
Do you remember your first typhoon that you went after after you moved to Japan?
Well, I was coming to Japan as a tourist to chase the typhoon. So actually my first year of ever doing this, back in 2005, I hopped from Taiwan to Okinawa to film a typhoon, or to experience the typhoon. The storm actually kind of missed the island, but it still brought a lot of rough weather. But I moved here in 2017, which was a quiet year. There weren't that many typhoons. But then 2018 to 2019, it was just like turbocharged Japan typhoon season. Okinawa got blasted, the main islands, Tokyo got blasted, Osaka got blasted. It was like a real freak couple of years where there were like multiple like $1 billion plus, typhoon disasters on the mainland. And then it went quiet again. So I've lost track of the number of typhoons I've filmed.
Have you noticed any difference perhaps between the typhoons you've observed and chased here in Japan compared to those that you've experienced in Hong Kong, which is also pretty prone to typhoons, or Taiwan, or that you've seen in Philippines and Vietnam and Southeast Asia?
Yeah, there's generally, depending on which area you're in, the nature of the typhoons can change. So basically, these are tropical storms. They really thrive in deep tropical hot places. So the Philippines, it's deep below the Tropic of Cancer. It's very, hot and humid down there. Perfect conditions for these typhoons and tropical storms to form. And the sea temperatures are warmer down there as well. There's no real proper winter down, in the Philippines. Mm-hmm. So it's in those areas, south of 20 degrees north, within the tropics, where you generally see the strongest storms. Now, the main islands of Japan, we're up at about 30 degrees, 35 degrees north. So we're quite a way outside of the tropics. We have a winter here, it can snow in Tokyo. The sea temperatures get a lot colder over the winter months, so we don't get any typhoons. So generally, where we are up here, the further north you are, the more hostile the conditions are for the typhoons. So most of the time that the storms that are making landfall in mainland Japan, the winds aren't too bad compared to when you go further south to Okinawa. Okay, that's slightly further south. It's warmer, humid, more humid. The sea temperatures are higher. They get stronger typhoons. You go even further south down to the Philippines, well, that's where you get the strongest storms in the world. But as I mentioned before, just because the winds might not be blowing so strong, the storms can still cause immense amounts of damage and be very deadly.
In the years after you arrived, you said 2018, 2019, Japan got blasted pretty heavily, including Osaka, where we are now, and Tokyo. What have you experienced there? What was it like?
So 2018 was a typhoon called Jebi. Now, Japan, they don't actually use the names of the storms. They use a numbering system, which makes it really easy to forget what the number of the typhoon was. But it was, I think it was in September. And it was a very, very powerful Category 5 typhoon. far south of Japan in the tropical Pacific, and it slowly started to weaken as it was approaching mainland Japan. And I jumped in the car to go chase it, and assumed it would be like kind of every other mainland kind of Japanese typhoon I've chased. It would be unraveling, the winds wouldn't be too bad, but I'd chase it anyway and get some shots of the waves by the coast and whatever. I thought it would be quite a straightforward chase. But it was one of those storms which just kind of confounded my expectations and caught, I think, everyone off guard. And this thing came roaring ashore with far more ferocity than I think everyone was expecting. So I was down towards south of Osaka, south of now Wakayama, is that?
Wakayama.
Yeah, it's on the western side of the Kii Peninsula. Forgive my getting confused with the geography. So I was about 2 hours south of Osaka, right on the coast where it came ashore, and it was wild down there. It was like stuff flying through the streets. And then that typhoon, it just did not weaken. It went straight up between, the channel, the sea, smashed into Kansai International Airport, submerged the airport with storm surge. I think a ship broke loose and smashed into the bridge and damaged that. Tore right through Osaka. Like, I remember at the time the clips appearing on YouTube of just, K-trucks flying away and just roofs getting ripped off buildings and the damage, flooding, storm surge at the container port. There was so much wild footage of crazy things happening. I think afterwards everyone was quite shell-shocked and like, what the heck was that? It's been quite a long time since a typhoon of that ferocity had hit, the mainland. And then the next year, 2019, basically the same thing happens, but in Tokyo. This freak storm spun up. Instead of weakening really rapidly, it maintained its strength and it smashed up Chiba. And the winds were incredible, some record-breaking wind speeds. And so, yeah, there was a very kind of punishing 2 years then. But then since then, it's kind of been quiet. That's just the way it goes.
So you're in the middle of those. You just said you were in Wakayama where the storm first hit before making its way up to Osaka. Yeah. You're there with your camera and equipment. Yeah. What are you after? What are you trying to capture?
I'm trying to capture the worst of the storm, the absolute most difficult conditions to film where the storm is doing its worst and being its most angry. And usually that means being on the coast at the first point of contact where the storm is hitting land, because that's where you're getting the winds ripping off the ocean. You're getting the maximum effects of the waves and any storm surge. The storm hasn't had that much of a chance to weaken yet. And I'm just trying to capture those rare, unique images which show the true, unfiltered ferocity of Mother Nature and of what these storms are capable of.
You said that what started your career a little bit into producing these videos is producer, director from Germany reaching out and asking if your footage could be used for a bigger documentary. Yeah. What is your footage being used for now? Is it still mostly documentary purpose, or do you also see like kind of possible scientific research done based off images you are able to capture at the center of storms?
My footage has been used in absolutely every different kind of context you can imagine, and even some which you wouldn't think would ever need footage for. So the obvious ones are always like Discovery Channel, National Geographic. Those are the kind of outlets how it all started. Universities, NASA, weather bureaus, charities, fundraising appeals after big disasters. Those ones are always, I consider, very important uses of the footage. Then it starts getting a bit weird. I don't know if you ever watched the film Sharknado.
I have.
Yeah, I had footage in that. My my footage has been in a film with The Rock, starring in it. I've been sat on planes watching movies, and there's been shots of mine in the opening sequences and stuff. So, we're talking about such a wide variety of different uses. And then obviously social media, YouTubers, kids, university students doing their projects, high school kids, any possible kind of random use for footage you can think of. I've had people make requests.
If it's used for these kind of bigger production too, I imagine you need to be able to deliver a certain quality of footage, right?
Yes.
You cannot use a phone or hand cam or something like that. What kind of gear do you prepare? And my follow-up question to that will be, how do you manage yourself and your safety when you're trying at the same time to capture some footage that you need for a documentary, for a movie or something like that?
Yeah, the gear is like, it's that never-ending the kind of challenge and balancing act of trying to get the best gear you can whilst being portable, because I'm jumping on planes. I got to get all this stuff through the airport. And not having such precious gear that, if it gets destroyed in a storm, and I have destroyed many cameras in storms, that I'm not going to go bankrupt, spending thousands and thousands of dollars on new cameras every 2 years. So it really is a delicate balancing act. And again, it's evolved over the years as technology has improved. I'm always trying to stay with ahead of the mainstream format right now. So I was an early-ish adopter of 4K. So Typhoon Haiyan, I killed my camera, my main Sony camera, which was HD, in 2013. So 2014, I graduated to 4K cameras. And then last year, I've graduated up to a 6K camera. So having these rare, unique images in a very crisp, clear, high bitrate format makes it more appealing to especially the higher end productions who might come inquiring after footage. But that being said, you do get lumbered down with a lot of gear. When you got like a camera attached to a tripod, the variety of shots you can get diminishes a lot because you're kind of fixed in more or less one location. So what I like doing now is just whipping out my iPhone, put it in a protective case, and just go run around a little bit, knock off some shots, and suddenly I got 10 shots. The quality isn't quite so good, but I got more of a variety. So it's all about kind of trying to find the right balance. But when you're looking after a big, slightly more expensive camera, you're generally making sure you're filming in a place where it's not going to get trashed by wind or debris, and then by default that means you're going to be in a slightly safer location as well. So
it's like a trade-off, basically.
Yeah,
you have to balance if you're going after the shot or if you're going after just, let's say, quality.
Yeah, so it's the last couple of typhoons I filmed, I actually did decide to just use the iPhone, run around a bit more. And the variety of content I got, and actually some of the shots I got were way more compelling and interesting than if I'd just been stuck on the tripod with the bigger camera. So, it's always a bit of a kind of a work in progress, figuring out what works and what doesn't. So we'll see.
You mentioned a couple of times now you go out there by yourself mostly and film and you do your work. And that not that many people do this job that you have. But have you had the opportunity to connect maybe with Japanese storm chasers? Does this exist? Is there a community, even ever so small, of people that do this actively, regularly, that you've been able to exchange with and work together?
It's one thing I've always wondered if because I've probably chased more typhoons than anyone else in the world. It's just, there's not many of us. But I've always wondered, is there someone out there who just doesn't publicize what they do and is as passionate about this as I am, but has just kept it all on the down low? Who knows? Maybe there is. But in Japan, I've only really in the past collaborated with journalists or film crews. So mostly as like a guide or a consultant. but the majority of the time I'm by myself. Sometimes when I go overseas, I have a very good friend of mine who lives in Taiwan, and we've gone on a lot of adventures together. Chasing volcanoes, typhoons, and I prefer it because it's a lot safer when you got a buddy with you who you can watch your back and you can discuss things with. You can assess whether a certain place is safe or whether you think you're cutting corners, or it just helps with the decision making and just bouncing ideas off someone else. I think it just generally makes things safer. But then there are trade-offs as well, I'm a pretty independent person. If I need to be somewhere to get a shot and I want to be there, I don't want to have to make sure that's okay with someone else. So again, it's one of these things. Everything in this game is a bit of a balancing act for trying to find out what the right formula is. But yeah, majority of the time it's by myself, and it can be pretty unpleasant sometimes.
Do you have an experience, a typhoon, that you recall as like your limit, and you're like, okay, this is as far as I'm willing to go. This was too close. I'm not taking any further risks than I've taken. Yeah,
actually, that's a great question. And there was once, it was 12 years ago in Okinawa. So I was by myself down there. There was this typhoon. It had blown up into a Cat 5 deep in the tropical Pacific. And it had really unraveled and was looking terrible. It had weakened for some reason. So I was in Okinawa just waiting for it. My expectations weren't too great. And I was like, okay, it'll be a run-of-the-mill storm. Not going to be a big deal. And then about 12 hours before landfall, it really started wrapping up again. The eye popped out, got nice and clear again, and the storm was clearly intensifying. And it was coming in at night. And the two storms prior to this typhoon I'm talking about hadn't gone well. I'd messed up. I'd been out of position. I'd made some mistakes. Things hadn't gone right. So I was really determined not to mess this storm up. And I really wanted to get in the eye of it. I really wanted to be where I needed to be to film it. And that meant a last-minute relocation in the middle of the night, right as the storm was starting to push across the island. I was by myself. It was a really, really unpleasant, scary drive. It was what I call like a washing machine mode, when the rain and the wind is so heavy. You're driving your car at night and all you can see is just like the lights of your headlights against a wall of white. You can't even see where the road is. I've got to negotiate my way to this small village on the coast halfway up the island. Do I take the right-hand side of the island, which the road goes along the coast, but which is on the side of the storm, or do I take the left-hand side of the island, which is going to take longer, but it might be slightly more sheltered and safer? I chose the left-hand side. The roads on the right-hand side ended up being, completely flooded out. And if I'd gone that way, it would have been a disaster. I get to my location at 3 o'clock in the morning. The storm hits, I'm pinned down, and then suddenly I see like seawater starting to lap up against where I am. I look at my car and the water's starting to get really quite close to the engine block, and I'm like, yeah, I'm way in over my head here. What am I doing? This is stupid. If I need to escape this location, where am I going to go? I managed to get the car out just in time before it got flooded. The seawater didn't come up any further. The seawall did its job. There wasn't any storm surge. Got in the eye and was like, what an idiot. This isn't how you chase safely or properly. And it was a good learning experience. And from that, I've developed a lot of kind of fear is a bit of a strong word, but nervousness exists from that moment on. So whenever I have to get in my car at night and drive through a typhoon, I remember that and I don't enjoy it. Yeah.
When you look at the eye of a typhoon from space, it just looks super clear. It's very calm, beautiful. The sun is shining through. What is it like when you're in the typhoon and suddenly you're in the eye, when you step into the center?
I've experienced this many, many times. and it never grows old. It is one of the most surreal, almost spiritual, humbling experiences. It's almost like, how is nature capable of these contrasts? So to get into the eye of the storm, you have to go through the worst of the storm. You have to go through those, 150 plus kilometer an hour winds. You have to go through, the flying debris, the flooding rains, just the chaos of the storm. And then you get in the eye. And no two eyes are the same, but you get into the eye and it's dead calm. There's lots of confused bugs and birds come out. There's dragonflies flying around. It's hot, it's dry. And this is all in the space of like about 10 minutes. So you go from hell on earth to like this bliss, peaceful calm in 10, 15 minutes. And it's like, wow, you get to have a break.
Is it really like you see all around you the kind of where the storm is, and you are kind of in this safe zone, and you see the next part of the storm coming in and you're in for a second round?
In the strongest, highest echelon storms, that is what it is like. It's rare. So most storms, once they start interacting with land, the eye, we call it fills in. So you get some kind of lower level clouds start mixing around inside, and it kind of blocks the view. But if you're on a tropical island or somewhere, quite flat down south, and it's a very strong storm making landfall and it can maintain that structure as it's crossing the coast, you'll be looking up at blue sky and a wall of clouds towering up to 50,000 feet surrounding you like a stadium. And they call that the stadium effect, because it's like being in the middle of the football pitch or baseball stadium or whatever, and you just look around and it's all the stands just surrounding you. And I think as a storm chaser, just on a purely personal level, that's kind of like the holy grail of like shots. I think that's all secretly what we're all hoping to achieve. I have seen it once, but it was a little bit messy. I haven't had that pure blue sky experience.
It must be quite a scary moment too, right? You suddenly have some relief, but you're like, it's not over, right? It's like a fake moment of relief where you're like, well, there's still the second half of it coming.
That's a point which a lot of people who have never been through a storm forget. The storm is not over. You're only halfway through. You got the back end of it to come through, and the calm slowly starts building up again, and then within a few minutes you're back in the peak violence of the storm. There's been storms down in the Okinawa, which I've filmed before, and they're making announcements, emergency announcements in the eye, going, the storm isn't over, this isn't the end, the violent weather will return. Just be aware of that. So it's interesting, and it can catch people off guard.
You've done this for 20 years now in this region of the world.
Yeah.
Have you noticed a change from your experience of observing the storms? Have they gotten stronger, more frequent, or is it just kind of following a certain pattern every year?
It's the world's climate is in a bit of a mess right now. How exactly that is going to affect typhoons, tropical cyclones, we don't really know yet. There are certain aspects which we are clear on. Basically the more energy that's locked up into the oceans, the warmer they get, the more energy that provides to these storms, so they can get stronger. It doesn't necessarily mean we're going to see more of them. Overall typhoon numbers are actually on the decline over the last 20 years. So since I've been chasing, the Western Pacific has been on a suppressed phase. And this kind of goes in cycles, very complex scientific reasons behind it all, which I don't quite fully understand. But one of the main things that scientists, and even I am noticing for sure, is incidents of rapid intensification, which is where you'll get a regular looking tropical storm or a minimal level typhoon, and just the pace at which it can transform into a monster, category 5, super typhoon, whatever. they're blowing up a lot quicker. And I kind of noticing that as well, even in the 20 years I've been doing this, which isn't that long a period, to get a real true sense of what's happening. But, I'm noticing these storms are blowing up very quickly, and it's, why exactly? I don't fully understand, but it's happening.
This year they said, I believe it's a sort of super El Nino year with like the water currents somehow changing across the oceans or being warmer. I'm not sure about the details. Is that going to have an effect on this year's typhoon season, which is just a couple of months away?
So it's very complex. Last year we saw El Nino. So that is where we have a large stretch of warm ocean waters off the coast of South America stretching through to the Central Pacific. Normally what that does is turbocharges typhoon season. It creates atmospheric conditions where the storms can thrive. They form in great numbers. Most of them stay out to sea, but plenty of them go on to hit land. So I was expecting a really busy year last year, but for whatever reason, we saw very few storms. So whether this is a weird product of climate change or what, I don't understand. But now it looks like the system is flipping to a La Nina, which is the opposite, where you get cooler waters stretching off the coast of South America into the Central Pacific. And what that usually does is creates fewer typhoons. The conditions aren't quite so good for them to form, and the storms are weaker. So right now, if I had to make a bet, I would bet that it's going to be a quieter typhoon season. But given the weirdness that happened last year, who knows? The best thing you can do is just prepare for typhoons. If you live in typhoon country, just make sure you've got your batteries charged and your water supply and everything. You're keeping an eye on the weather forecast. Japan is so well geared up for a multitude of different disasters. I think typhoons are a kind of people. If you're prepared for an earthquake, you're probably well prepared for a typhoon as well. So, yeah.
Throughout your years chasing typhoon, you mentioned also earlier you started looking into volcanoes too.
Yeah.
And Japan is a volcanic island, and kind of a sort of paradise if you're into this kind of research. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so this has kind of all gone in parallel to the typhoon work. Just lucky to live in a part of the world where there are a lot of volcanoes as well. That's just a coincidence. But, as someone who's always been interested in kind of weather and nature, being interested in storms, it's kind of natural to be interested in volcanoes as well. And Japan over the years has provided some fabulous opportunities for me to witness volcanic eruptions, to film them, get some spectacular, incredible footage and just personal life experiences as well. It's been absolutely some incredible opportunities here to film volcanoes.
So you hear about the potential eruption, let's say Sakurajima near Kagoshima comes to mind because we were there earlier this year. And it erupts frequently, and you see these towering mountains of ash spiking up the sky. And so you hear about this upcoming, and then you're like, okay, I'm going to go there and film and see what happens. Is it in the same optic of maybe having footage for documentaries, for gathering information? What are you after with the volcanoes?
That's exactly it. It's about just making the effort to get there and having the patience to be on the location at the volcano, because volcanoes require a lot of patience to get the shots, and being there at the right time to get the shots of the volcanic activity. And a lot of the time, it can be slightly difficult to reach places as well. So it's all about just being somewhere, witnessing an event and filming it when there's just not many other people around. So that kind of gives value to whatever I'm shooting. So a great example was just north of Sakurajima is a volcanic complex called Kirishima.
The Fog Mountain?
Yes.
Fog Island?
Yeah, that would make sense. Yeah. absolutely one of the most. So in Kyushu, Asosan is very famous, and I feel like Kirishima is a little bit overlooked. But in my opinion, I think Kirishima is even more spectacularly beautiful than Asosan. I highly recommend anyone go visit there if you like hiking and volcanoes. It's amazing. But back in 2017, it started erupting again for the first time in 50 years. So I was monitoring the webcams, and I jumped on a plane down there. As soon as I saw the smallest waft of little ash come out of the crater, I jumped on a plane, got down there, hiked up to within 2 kilometers of the erupting crater, and waited. And it was a bit like a day like today. The weather was perfect. The sun was out. It wasn't too hot. Sun was rising, and I got up to my vantage point just as this steam plume was coming out of the volcano, and I could hear this noise, which was like, a jet fighter taking off. It was just like this deep roar coming from this volcano, and this beautiful plume of steam coming out. I was like, wow, that's beautiful. And right in front of me, the whole mountain just went off. It was like witnessing the birth of an eruption. Suddenly this like black ash started spewing out of it. And then within half an hour, it was just this towering ash cloud 2 kilometers away from me. And I was like, oh my, wow, this is one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. But that's what you get when you kind of take the gamble to jump on that plane, climb that mountain, and make the effort to be in the right place. And if you're lucky, you'll be there at the right time, and you end up getting shots, which people love.
How do you prepare yourself for a volcano, right? Because a typhoon, you see it on the map a few days out, and you see it developing, you see the trajectory. Meteorologists will forecast where it's going to make landfall. Of course, it can change last minute, it can intensify, but you can plan and prepare what you do where you are. The volcano can erupt, and an eruption can mean just a tower of smoke, but it can also mean lava just spitting out. Yeah. And if you're in the path of this, you're done.
So volcanoes are scary, but they're a lot more relaxing, if that makes sense. They're not moving, for starters. So, I know where I'm going. I don't have to suddenly change location at the last minute or whatever. And a very important part of my volcano work is having a good understanding of the nature of the activity of the volcano. And each volcanoes in different parts of the world kind of display different types of activity. So everyone knows about Iceland or Hawaii, very famous volcanoes where you get lots of tourists. They walk right up to the eruption and they can see the lava, and nice and easy, pretty safe. Where we are in Japan, in Asia, the volcanoes are very different. You can't do that. You can't get too close to them because they don't ooze lava, they explode violently. So it's all about really having kind of a good understanding of the threats that they pose, and just keeping it respectful. And that's an important part, respectful. You need to respect the volcano and give it the distance it needs so that you can be safe but still get a good view. But yeah, there've been a few kind of concerning moments over the years, and a few times where just due to circumstances I've ended up being closer than I should have been. But they're a different beast, but they're equally as humbling and incredible to witness.
What is the reaction like when you start sharing all your work? You capture all these very unique images and make documentaries about very difficult times for many people. Comes to mind again that documentary you made about Typhoon Haiyan that destroyed a part of the Philippines. When you share this and you put it out there in the world for people to see, what kind of reaction do you get?
I'm very lucky. I'm blessed with a very, very supportive, wonderful following on Twitter primarily and YouTube as well. So my audience really appreciate what I publish. And I think it comes down to an important aspect of my work and what I do, because a lot of the times it's quite sensitive content, sensitive circumstances. When I'm filming a storm, for a lot of people, that day is the worst day of their entire life, or maybe the last day of their life. That's always in the back of my mind when I'm working. So I always have the philosophy that whatever I publish, I would feel comfortable publishing that directly to someone who's, been affected by the storm or whatever. And I think because of that, a huge amount of support, and I think a lot of people genuinely find it very, very helpful. Especially these days where there's such a jumble of information out there, especially on social media, and a lot of people that's their primary source of information. And there's a lot of kind of manipulative bad actors out there who are just spouting inaccurate nonsense to get clicks. So I think my audience I think the most important part of my brand and my work is just my integrity. Is like when you go on my feed and you see my content, there's no exaggeration, there's no nonsense. It is what it is, and it's accurate. And that's what I kind of make the most effort to ensure happens. And yeah, I think that the audience, really appreciate that.
And you do use some of your work as well for charity, as you mentioned, to gather help for the people that have been affected by places you've been.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, a lot of the times the events I'm covering, they're not big disasters. So, say for example, Okinawa, Miyakojima, Ishigaki, the storms are a pain for the local residents, but they're not disasters. But just because they get hit by so many storms and they're so well prepared for them, they're not a big disaster. But every now and again, yeah, obviously I'll be filming a storm somewhere, and it is a big deal. And I'm obviously, if my footage can be used to help spread the word about the new, help just spread word about the effects of the storm and the disaster. Excuse me. Okay, let's do that bit again. If my footage can be helpful to just spread awareness of the disaster and what's going on, if it can help with charities, fundraising, whatever, that's great. But one thing I've noticed in the major disasters that I have covered, and this is quite interesting, is that the direct victims and people who are affected by it, and this isn't necessarily the case everywhere, but just personally what I've noticed where I've worked is that they really appreciate a conscientious documentation of this traumatic event. It's almost like a record, like a historical record kind of thing. Especially in the Philippines, I noticed that with Typhoon Haiyan, which was devastating. It killed thousands of people. And we were outsiders in that town, documenting it, filming the aftermath. And the overwhelming majority of people were thankful for that and appreciated that we'd published this work and for them to watch for years to come.
Authentic journalism.
Yeah, I guess so.
You mentioned that also a lot of people suffer from misinformation. People take advantage of social media to share inaccurate information about storms that are coming, about the events that are happening, and about the aftermath. What are some of the biggest misinformation that you see and that you want to dispel, maybe, that you'd like people to know this is not true, this cannot happen, or just be aware of these things?
Yeah, it's hard to pinpoint specific locations, but what the most common thing you'll see is a typhoon forming, out in the Pacific near Guam or whatever, and then you'll see people just spouting complete nonsense, just over-hyping and over-exaggerating the threat because they want clicks for their stupid Facebook page or whatever. Headlines, oh yeah, we're going to get, there could be a super typhoon gonna hit us in 5 days, when there is no solid evidence that is the case. Now, obviously, once there are some, concerning looking forecasts or whatever, then yes, there's there is, a legitimate case for starting to slowly ease that dramatic message in. But people love these days to just throw the really super worst case dramatic scenarios out too quickly. And the problem with that is it just desensitizes people for when that rare occasion there is something really bad coming. And they're like, I've heard this like 10 times before. And, it was never a big deal. And then suddenly a major storm comes and no one's taking it seriously. So I think it's just vet your sources. Don't believe everything you see on social media and just critical thinking, just don't just take everything you see from some Twitter or Facebook page, as verbatim truth. Just put the extra time in to just double check it.
I think in Japan, there's a Japan Meteorological Agency that has an official website with live updates, especially during the typhoon season, where you can find locations, directions, data that you may find useful, available for free to everyone. Yeah,
actually, we've got an abundance of really good resources here. Obviously, mostly in Japanese, but I think JMA, jma.go.jp and NHK have really good multilingual resources. And if you can speak Japanese, there's like Yahoo Weather and Tenki.jp are really good apps and resources for tracking storms, and on Twitter as well. And their information is legit. They know what they're doing, and they put out reliable information.
20 years of documentary work, and you said you want to keep doing this for the next 20. Are there specific things that you want to document? Maybe places you haven't been you'd like to go, whether it's volcanoes or maybe look at not typhoons, but cyclones or hurricanes and see something else?
I'm very comfortable doing what I'm doing, which isn't necessarily a good thing because it's always good to continue to push the envelope of your comfort zone. The US is seeing a lot of hurricane activity. I think it's going to be a busy year in the US, so I'm going to be branching out there more to film the hurricanes. It's quite a saturated market over there. There's a lot of storm chasers in the US, which puts me off. If I can be the only one on a storm on some far-flung island in the middle of a big ocean, that's where I'm in my true element work-wise. But I'll try and put the noise aside and concentrate on the basics of what I do. So, who knows how long I'll be doing this. It can be stressful and hard work at times. There are dangers. I have a young family to come home to. But each time I go through a stressful storm and I hate it, and I'm saying to myself, why am I doing this? This is ridiculous. And then I get home. You know what the first thing I do is?
Look at the footage. Well, after hugging your family.
Now I go on the computer and see, right, where's the next storm? I'm checking the weather and is that going to spin up and do something? Oh, well, if it is, I'll be on it. It's like a weird drug. I think a psychologist would have a field day trying to figure it out, because I haven't quite figured it out.
We covered a lot of topics today, from your early move to Japan, your interest into storm chasing, what's it like, and the experience you've had. Do you feel like there's something we haven't covered, maybe some specific element of your work that you'd like to share, or something that people should know about storm chasing or about storms in general that we haven't covered so far?
I think we've covered a lot of the main points, but I don't know, advice won't be the right way to describe it. But I just think, especially if there's any younger viewers or viewers with young kids, I think if you can just be curious, be humble, spend time in nature, I think everyone benefits from all of that. Those are the core tenets of why I do my storm chasing and volcano work is because I'm curious, is because I love nature, and it's humbling. And I think everyone needs to be humbled, more regularly than we are in day-to-day life.
You see the true power of nature.
You do, and you realize it makes you realize how, if you're blessed with a safe and stable home, just how precious that is and how fragile it is, especially here in Japan, because all of our lives at any moment could be totally upended if there's a major earthquake. That's just something we live with here. So I think it's just certainly for any younger folks, who've got their whole lives ahead of them. I think nature and just being curious, all the drivers which drive me are good things and will go towards giving you a kind of a fulfilling life. So, yeah.
You just mentioned one thing that actually brought up another question from me about Japan, where we are in a place where there are a lot of risks, earthquakes, volcanoes, typhoons. I'm curious about the response from the Japanese government and authorities towards typhoons and so on. Do you see any special preparedness here, whether it's in terms of facilities that are readily available, whether it's in terms of the warning system, the organization for all these events that are different or unique to Japan and that are not in other countries?
I think Japan is like a case study for the rest of the world when it comes to disaster resilience. I can't think of anywhere else in the world which one gets such a variety of different natural hazards, earthquakes and tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, tropical cyclones, snowstorms. I think the only thing we don't really get are tornadoes here, but we kind of get everything else. And just the way that the government, but more society, I think, should take more of the credit than the government as such. Just the way the infrastructure has been developed, the culture has mobilized to prepare for these devastating events, which sadly regularly strike the country. And I think a lot of the rest of the world could learn a lot from Japan and should take note of the way things are done here. We have incredible warning systems. Earthquake early warning
on the phone
alarms,
directly, everyone around you when you're in a train.
If there's a flood alert, it comes through on your phone. You have the infrastructure which is geared up to deal with a lot of these storms and earthquakes. But what I love personally, specific to Japan, is I have the freedom when a storm is hitting or whatever to go wherever I want. I don't have some overzealous cop on the street, pointing a gun in my face saying, "You got to get out of here," enforced it. No,
sounds like an experience.
Elsewhere, I have the complete freedom to do what I want to do, where I want to do it, and when I want to do it. I don't recommend people who aren't used to typhoons doing that. I really value that. Because you go to some places and it's like, there's a lockdown, there's a curfew, this, that, whatever, and it just makes, for whatever reasons, we don't need that in Japan. And I really appreciate that.
Thank you for answering my last question here and for answering all the previous ones. It was very interesting to hear your story and kind of understand more about your work, your documentary, your research, and what's it like going into the eye of a storm. For everyone that's curious, we'll of course link to your channel so they can see your experiences firsthand, Earth Uncut TV, and then hopefully we'll get a lot of questions as well. Thank you, James, for coming and sharing.
No, it's been great to chat with you, and thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for listening and watching. This was Unpacking Japan, and we'll be back next week. Bye. Are you looking for another podcast episode to listen to next? If you like the one you just listened to, I'm sure you'll also enjoy the one that I've selected and linked in the description down below. Go check it out.